Good morning. Good morning and welcome to the 121st Landon Lecture on Public Affairs. The Landon Lectures were begun in 1966 by the late Governor Alf Landon and the late K-State President James McCain. The goal of the Landon Lectures is to bring the most prominent public figures to Kansas State University to discuss the pressing issues of the day. We are very pleased today to welcome Dr. Ernesto Zedillo to the Landon podium to join 120 predecessors in bringing their thoughts and opinions on the important issues facing America and the world. Before introducing Dr. Zedillo, I would like to introduce other members of the platform party. On my left, Dr. Mickey Ranson, Professor of Agronomy and President of the K-State Faculty Senate. Next to him, Kyle Barker, a junior in political science and journalism and our student body president. Kyle? On my right, Chairman of the Landon Patrons, Editor-in-Chief and Publisher of the Manhattan Mercury, Edward Seaton. Next to him, Dr. Charles Reagan, Associate to the President and Chairman of the Landon Lecture Series. Dr. Ernesto Zedillo served as the President of Mexico from 1994 until December of 2000. He was thrust into the presidential political arena by the dramatic and unfortunate assassination of Mr. Luis Colosio, the PRI party presidential candidate. From his very first day in office, he called for further and definitive political reforms to achieve democracy in Mexico. This became an undeniable reality during President Zedillo's presidency, as shown by the victory of the opposition party candidate, Dr. Vicente Fox, as the President of Mexico in the last election. At the very beginning of his term in office, President Zedillo's government had to confront a major financial and economic crisis, as I'm sure you will recall. He did not hesitate to take bold actions when deemed necessary to overcome the adverse situation. The 5-year period with the highest gross domestic product growth in recent Mexico history was achieved during his term. But economic discipline was not pursued at the expense of social justice and reform during the Zedillo presidency. For example, he started 2 major Mexican social reforms, a federal anti-poverty program and a public-private pension system. Every year, social programs in Mexico were allocated an increasing proportion of the federal budget until reaching their highest historical share in the year 2000. Before serving as the President of Mexico, Dr. Zedillo had a long career at the Mexico Central Bank and also served as the Undersecretary of the Budget and later as Secretary of Economic Programming. In 1992, he was appointed Secretary of Education with a mandate to launch a sweeping reform for the national basic educational system. Dr. Zedillo received his undergraduate degree from the School of Economics at the National Polytechnical Institute and received a PhD in economics from Yale University. By the way, this is President Zedillo's first public speech since he left the presidency of Mexico. It is a pleasure for me, and it's an honor for Kansas State University to welcome the former president of Mexico and a leader that Mexican historians are now referring to, quote, as the father of Mexican democracy, Dr. Ernesto Zedillo, to the landing podium. Thank you very much.
President Wiefel, dear students, dear professors, dear members of the Kansas State University community, ladies and gentlemen. A few days before I concluded my mandate as President of Mexico, I was reading some correspondence. It was late at night after a very busy day. I briefly stopped to wonder about my future life, admittedly with a tiny bit of anxiety. Then I restarted my reading. Soon I found a letter from Edward Seaton. I recall reading something like, Mr. President, and now I quote, "After you finish your term, you will be looking for work to support your family. I cannot offer permanent employment, but I do share the patrons of a lecture series at Kansas State University that would be delighted to have you participate." I guess to make his point stronger, Ed added, "It pays expenses and an honorarium." I relaxed. I realized that after all, there was life after the presidency. Thank you, Ed. Thank you, President Wiffel, for your invitation and your extremely kind presentation. Thanks, Chairman Reagan. Thank you, Senator Casaubon-Baker. Thanks to all the patrons of the Landon Lecture Series. Like every speaker before me in this lecture series, I pay sincere tribute to the memory of Governor Landon. And perhaps the best way I can do this is by addressing, albeit from a somewhat different perspective, a fundamental concern he had as a true statesman of his time: the stability of our world. I start today by submitting that the biggest threat to such stability are violent conflict and poverty among the peoples of this world. Old and new disputes between peoples, incongruous with the modern moral and political values of mutual tolerance, continue to render ours an unsafe world. This fact is constantly and abruptly attested by means as mundane as the evening news. Throughout the world, poverty poses an even greater threat to stability than conflict, in spite of the unprecedented economic and technological prosperity that has been achieved since the end of this Second World War. According to the United Nations Organization, half of the world's population lives on less than $2 a day. 80% of the global population lives on less than 20% of the global income. Disparities in people's access to education, health, nutrition, and job opportunities are equally dramatic among and indeed within countries. Of course, I do not come here, nor am I qualified, to say all that has to be done to overcome conflict and poverty among the peoples of the world. But this morning, I do intend to convey to you with all conviction that a vital part of the solution consists of promoting among the peoples and the nations of the world more interdependence, or as they say now, more globalization. The essence of this assertion is very simple: more international trade, more investment flowing across countries, more knowledge diffused internationally among communities and individuals. By creating wealth, shared opportunities, and common interests will do much to defeat the evils of conflict and poverty during this new century. Of course, this is a very old idea. About 2 centuries ago, Adam Smith and David Ricardo, the most distinguished classical economists, explained how free trade can enhance the wealth and welfare of nations. And in the mid-19th century, Cobden, the British politician and pacifist and an outstanding opponent of protectionism, affirmed that free trade is God's diplomacy and there is no other certain way of uniting peoples in the bonds of peace. These are good old principles, but unfortunately not generally accepted and frequently bitterly opposed. Just recall the television images of violent protests of a few days ago in Quebec City at the Summit of the Americas, or of December 1999 in Seattle at the World Trade Organization meetings. An unusual mixture of extreme leftists and rightists, trade unionists, radical environmentalists, and self-appointed representatives of civil society have joined forces in Seattle, Quebec City, on the web, and in many other places to save the poor people of developing countries from development, that is, from prosperity and social justice. The protesters, whom I like to call globophobics, will not agree with this portrayal of their motives. They believe they have purely altruistic reasons for opposing globalization. But on close scrutiny, their common agenda turns out to be sheer protectionism, mostly targeted against developing countries. In my view, they are as wrong as those within the political establishments of both developed and developing countries who continue to believe that isolationism is a good policy. Isolationism never was and never will be a good policy. Throughout modern history, autarky and isolation have been major causes of backwardness, poverty, confrontation, and even political oppression, all with a high toll of human suffering. The bad lessons of protectionism and isolation are to be found even in the United States, long distinguished for its economic and political freedom. Let us not forget the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, which brought US import tariffs to their highest protective level in the country's history and prompted widespread protectionism. The act had calamitous consequences for international trade. It dislocated American foreign policy and contributed in a significant measure to the Great Depression. Fortunately, the genius of Roosevelt made that dark age of American history rather short-lived. Other countries have not been so lucky. Many in Latin America, for example, failed to develop to their enormous potential in the 20th century because of their protectionist and interventionist economic policies. Lack of competition created very inefficient economies, bias against labor and consumers, propitious to corruption, and prone to recurrent balance of payments crisis. In contrast, one can see, based on sound historical evidence, that during the last 2 centuries, every country successfully emerging from underdevelopment has relied on integration into world markets, that is, exporting to and importing from other countries, and opening up to foreign investment and technology. In a word, every one of these countries has relied on interdependence. There are plenty of success stories to tell. The prosperity of what are today considered fully developed countries is due, in no small measure, to their access to world markets. This is the experience of the United States, the European Union, Japan, and Canada, and is starting to be the case in some emerging economies. Singapore, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, for example, which were extremely poor a few decades ago, now have some of the highest per capita incomes in the world, thanks fundamentally to their integration into the global economy. I have no doubt that this formula will also work in the case closest to my heart, Mexico, of course. My country's development was much delayed because of protectionism, framed during many years of poor macroeconomic management and asphyxiating state intervention in the economy. We were able to keep our bad policies for so long because of our relative isolation and lack of the check and balances usually provided by a true democratic system. Happily, those unfortunate circumstances are now a thing of the past. Mexico is now fully democratic and has one of the most open economies in the world. Mexico now has good foundations to attain sustained development in the years to come. Of course, that those foundations can and will be improved, I am pretty sure. Core to Mexico's new circumstances is the North American Free Trade Agreement. Contrary to the predictions of its early opponents and critics, NAFTA has performed quite well. Since it entered into force in 1994, the agreement has effectively supported Mexico's economic growth, which in 1996-2000 was the highest for a 5-year period in several decades. And NAFTA has been crucial in transforming into one of the world's biggest exporting powers to my country within just a few years. Within only 7 years, Mexico's exports, as well as the inflow of direct foreign investment, have increased more than 200%. Mexico sells much more, but it also buys much more from its partners. Mexico is now the second largest market for American exports. Last year alone, Mexico bought almost $130 billion worth of US products. Mexico now buys more from the US than Japan, the United Kingdom, and France put together. But the most meaningful story is not in the figures. It is in the people who, thanks to Mexico's participation in the global economy, now have better jobs to support their families. More than half of the new 3.5 million jobs created in the Mexican economy since late 1995 have been in activities related to foreign trade. Modest workers, skilled technicians, young engineers in many parts of Mexico have told me about their new occupations with enormous pride and satisfaction. I can recall now the glow in the face of many Mexicans, young Mexicans, like Rosa, a worker I talked to while visiting a television assembly plant in Juarez, Chihuahua, Mexico, a few years ago. She proudly showed me the skillful work she was doing. I remember her saying with enormous self-esteem that thanks to that job, she was helping her father to provide for the support of the family, and that her younger sister and brother were getting a good education. In Rosa, as in many other young workers throughout my country, I saw the real human face of globalization. Opponents of free trade rushed to point out that notwithstanding NAFTA, the wages and living standards of Mexican workers are still much below those of developed countries. They forget that for workers with newly acquired jobs in trade-related activities, the alternative is much worse. It is unemployment or a peripheral job with much lower income. They also forget that the new jobs are often an important step toward better opportunities. Rosa, for example, mentioned that she was attending technical school in the evening so she could soon become a supervisor. Surely, Rosa knows better than the globophobics that Rome, or for that matter, any of the great pre-Columbian cities, was not built in a day. Perseverance is the mother of achievement. It is because of the benefits of openness that I decided, as Mexico's president, to launch negotiations to achieve free trade with other countries and regions beyond NAFTA. We succeeded. By the time I concluded my presidential term, Mexico had free trade agreements with 32 countries, including the members of the European Union. Today, no other nation of the world has free trade agreements both with North America and with Europe. I know Mexico can do well, but that is not enough. In the 21st century, underdevelopment, poverty, and injustice must be overcome everywhere. This is a moral imperative, but it is also a matter of self-interest to every nation in the world. In the global village, sooner rather than later, somebody else's poverty very soon ends up being one's own problem of lack of markets for one's products, illegal immigration, pollution, contagious disease, insecurity, fanaticism, terrorism. A key ingredient in this endeavor is to get rid of remaining barriers to the free flow of products, services, and investments. Past efforts of global trade liberalization, notably the so-called Uruguay round, have been big steps forward. But more and better should and can be done. Immediate action must be taken simultaneously at both the global and the regional levels. At the global level, a new liberalization round is urgently needed. The previous one, the Uruguay round, was launched many years ago, in 1986, and certainly concluded with more pluses than minuses 7 years later. Serious studies report that a new round would bring about significant increases in the output of both developed and developing countries. Consequently, the case for a new round should be universally compelling. But purely parochial interest, and I should say negligence, on the part of the major trading powers have stood in the way. The infamous Seattle World Trade Organization meeting in December 1999 failed to launch a new round, not because of the globophobics protests in the streets, but because of sharp differences of opinion among both developed and developing countries. There will be a new chance in Qatar in November this year, when the WTO will hold a new ministerial meeting. Success in launching a new round will not come by itself. The richer trade players have a particular responsibility to make it happen. They must sort out big disagreements among themselves while addressing with both self-interest and generosity the legitimate concerns of developing countries. Not only richer countries, but every party involved will need to compromise. Developing countries must commit to get rid of remaining protectionism within a reasonable time frame. Reaching consensus for a new round of trade liberalization will not be possible without a comprehensive and well-balanced agenda of the issues to be tackled. These issues include complex topics such as dismantling the pernicious agricultural protectionism that still prevails in many of the richer countries, slashing the high import duties that still exist on certain industrial products, and preventing the abuse of anti-dumping measures. Welfare gains would be even greater if the new round also liberalizes trade in services and investment, if it yields a better system for settling disputes, and if it provides for new rules governing the management, transparency, and adequate funding of the WTO itself. This is a very ambitious agenda, but its bold undertaking is more than warranted by the scale of the development challenges we face throughout the world. At the regional level, promising avenues to achieve free trade should also be actively pursued. In the Americas, the outcome of the recent Quebec City Summit of the Americas must be applauded. Leaders of 34 American nations reiterated their commitment, first adopted in Miami in December 1994, to have in place the Free Trade Area of the Americas, FTAA, by year 2005. By the same token, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, APEC, should be reinvigorated. Late, also in 1994, the leaders of APEC, which includes practically all of the Asian and American countries bordering the Pacific, agreed on the goal of achieving free trade in the region by year 2010 in the case of developed economies, and by 2020 in the case of developing economies. This is a goal whose importance transcends the purely economic dimension, considering that the US, China, Russia, and Japan, all of them key players in world security and stability, are APEC members. Notice that the three NAFTA partners, the United States, Canada, and Mexico, are part of all three fora that are of great relevance for further trade liberalization, that is WTO, FTAA, and APEC. It is only reasonable to suggest that the NAFTA partners should agree on a common strategy to promote free trade and should undertake to play a catalytic role in the negotiations ahead. In this task, a firm guiding principle must be that regional agreements must be building blocks, not stumbling blocks, in the construction of the global trading system. This means that regional agreements must have full consistency with the WTO rules existing anew. Moving forward, I should say, moving uphill, in liberalizing world trade and investment is important not only to create new development opportunities, but also to avoid a costly and even disastrous reversal of the progress achieved thus far. Further liberalization is the most effective response to the new wave of globophobia, to which politicians of the most diverse kinds are accommodating too quickly. Some politicians have joined the globophobics for short-term electoral gains, under the cynical belief that globalization is anyways an irreversible process, driven by technological change in production methods, transport, and telecommunications, and therefore unaffected by politics. Such a view is mistaken. I believe, based above all on practical experience, that modern globalization has occurred because of the decisions and actions taken by nation states, which are fortunately, by the way, still run by political leaders. Global integration has been driven by technological progress and economic incentives, but it would be inconceivable in its present form without the host of fundamental political decisions that have taken place both at the national and international levels. The global integration we have today results from political decisions taken by sovereign states at the national level to liberalize domestic economies and foster the workings of the market, and at the international level to sign on to agreements to liberalize foreign trade and investment. And for example, the WTO, the European Union, and the NAFTA have not just happened as an inescapable result of technological progress. They are, above all, the result of political vision and decisions by sovereign states. Acknowledging the strong political roots of globalization brings with it both good and bad news. The good news is that, notwithstanding their current adverse reputation, politics and the decisions of nation states are still doing a lot of good. The bad news is that, contrary to the cynical beliefs I referred to before, globalization is not irreversible. Technological determinism is a fallacy today as it was before. The remarkable globalization of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, driven by technical progress in communications and energy, was largely reversed during the 1920s and 1930s by political decisions, with dramatic consequences for humankind, even as technical progress continued its forward march. Beware of the risk that politicians, wrongly more concerned about the next election than the next generation, can still resort to new forms of protectionism, can ignore the urgent need to continue striving for a rules-based international system, or at the very least, can make economic policy mistakes leading to a less propitious environment for the expansion of the international economy. Political leaders, rather than jumping on the bandwagon of emerging political correctness, which fallaciously imputes to globalization all the present evils of the world, should instead focus their thinking and actions on why some people and countries are able to take advantage of the opportunities provided by globalization, while others cannot and are consequently left behind. In my bet on the answer to that question, the bottom line, or perhaps I should say the dividing line, has to do with freedom. I deeply believe that people are left behind because they are not free when they lack food, education, training, health, basic human and political rights, security, elementary infrastructure, and employment opportunities. Provide the people left behind with these elements, through good social policies designed and applied by democratic institutions, and you will see them empowered to share fully the tremendous opportunities stemming from the market economy and globalization at large. Rosa, whom I mentioned earlier, told me that she and her parents had migrated from a tiny village in Michoacan state in the southwest of Mexico, where she had studied up to the 9th grade in a government school. I was glad to hear that even in a small and very poor town, there was a government secondary school. I guessed that without such a modest but meaningful education opportunity, Rosa would have never got her job at the television assembly plant. That secondary school probably is what put Rosa on the right side of the exclusion line. Of course, erasing the exclusion line is not easy. It requires democratic governments that can successfully combine sound macroeconomic policies, including inescapable fiscal discipline to achieve sustained economic growth, with social policies, sensible, human-centered, focused on the needest to win the fight against poverty and inequality. And let us admit that in many countries, the poorest ones in our world, good domestic policies and access to world markets will not be sufficient to let people jump the dividing line. International cooperation, much more vigorous and effective than we have today, will also be needed. In that respect, unfortunately, the status of development aid and all other forms of international cooperation is truly dismal. In the late 1960s, a commission headed by the Nobel Peace Prize winner and remarkable free trader, Lester Pearson, recommended better-off countries to provide 0.7% of their gross domestic product in official development assistance, a criterion that was endorsed at the time by the United Nations and by many donor governments. It is sad that today, official development assistance is much less than half that figure, only 0.24% of the GDP of donor countries on average. I sincerely hope that self-interest will soon mobilize the will and the resources of the richer countries to provide more aid where it's needed. Meanwhile, the striving for global free trade must continue. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope that my words here today will help to make new allies for this cause. As Governor Landon recognized on the occasion of the first of this lecture series, the benefits go to both rich and poor. Governor Landon affirmed in that lecture, and I quote, "Freer trade enables people of different nations to become better acquainted with the customs, beliefs, ways of life, government policies of one another. When international understanding is thus achieved, political tensions are reduced and voices of reason are easier heard and understood. The way," and I continue quoting Governor Landon, "is then prepared to move toward world stability, increased prosperity, higher standards of living and education, and peaceful competitive existence in international markets." Great vision and courage were needed to recognize and express this promise in 1966, right in the middle of the Cold War. Today, we must be at least as bold as Governor Landon was at the time. Faced with the threat of rising poverty, disease, environmental degradation, and conflict, we must grab the promise of freer trade and make it a reality. In countries across the world, we must help millions like Rosa cross the exclusion line. We must make true interdependence the reality of the new century. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you. Excellent. Excellent. Thank you so much. Would you be willing to answer some questions?
Okay.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, for a superb presentation. He's agreed to answer some questions here this morning, if there are any. And we have microphones on your left and on your right.
Zedillo, bienvenido. I am an immigration law attorney here in Manhattan, and I am concerned, you spoke of the free flow of services from your country to our country. I feel that the people of Mexico are Mexico's greatest asset, even greater than oil. I know that our government is now seeking crude oil from Mexico. But I believe we, in a large part, are rejecting the crude or unrefined people of Mexico that come here to our country and labor and are, in effect, the oil of our economy. What are your ideas about the free flow of services? I know a free border is impossible and not good, but what is your ideas towards immigration, or how are your feelings towards President Fox's proposals towards immigration?
Well, I thank you for your question. I spoke of free flow of services not only between Mexico and the United States. I think that it is very promising if we achieve liberalization of the flow of services across all countries of the world. And if we achieve that, that is going by itself is the problem of migration of people. If we allow people to sell from Mexico services into the United States, and if we allow services to be sold from the United States to Mexico, then we will see that both Mexico and the United States will be better off, and it will be easier for Mexico to catch up in the development levels, a big gap that now exists. And when we are able to close that gap, then the pressures of not legal migration will ease significantly. In the meanwhile, I think a reality of the 21st century, particularly the early years, the early decades of the 21st century, is that there will still be enormous incentives for people to move around seeking better economic opportunities. The Mexican-American case is not unique. I would say that even the circumstances through which Europe is going are even more complex and even more dramatic, because just across the Mediterranean, they have Africa, where there's a lot of poverty, inequality, backwardness. And on the other hand, the population of Europe has stabilized. So they need the people, but of course, for very complex reasons that I cannot explain at length here, it's very hard for them or impossible for them to just open their borders for that migration from Africa. But somehow this problem has to be managed. Somehow developed countries have to recognize that they need the labor force coming from developing countries. And it's better to have an organized system to acquire those services and just don't let it happen in the way it has happened, unfortunately, in the past, with very serious problems to all parties. So I, as most people, welcome very much this new stage in the Mexico-US relationships, speaking about, in more objective terms, about the migration problem.
Thank you very much.
Here's a couple of questions.
Dr. Zedillo, I wanted to ask your opinion on the role of international organizations. One of the criticisms of groups like the International Monetary Fund is that they take policies designed for Latin American crises and then apply them to Asian crises or post-Soviet crises blindly. I'm wondering if you agree, if you think that's a fair criticism of the IMF, and to what degree the IMF does design good policies for particular problems of Latin America.
Well, I think that up to the limit of the resources available to the IMF has played a very important and positive role in supporting countries that have faced a balance of payment crisis in recent years. And I can speak with certain technical, moral and political authority because when I just became president, and that was mentioned, I think, in President Wifel's presentation, we had to face a very dramatic financial crisis, balance of payments and confidence crisis. And at the time, we had the support from the IMF, and of course, a catalytic role to get that support was played by the US government. Of course, people would like to think that when you face those crises can be solved without pain, without effort, without sacrifice. Well, there is no such a thing. Usually, those crises occur when there is a macroeconomic disequilibrium, implying that countries are either overspending or were taking too much money from abroad. And suddenly markets realize that there might be a solvency problem. And therefore, support is needed to improve the solvency situation of that country. But that cannot be achieved unless very painful actions and decisions are taken. So there is no a magic recipe to face those crises. Every time you have a problem like that, you have to go through a process of austerity. The more quickly you take those decisions, the more quickly also you get out of the crisis. And I think that was proven in the Mexican case, as it was proven in the Asian crisis. In late 1998, people were very gloomy about the perspectives of Asia. People were saying that it will take many years for the Korean, the Thai, the Malaysian economy to recover. At the time I said openly, that I was very confident that if they did the right things, pretty soon they will resume economic growth. Fortunately, I was right.
Thank you.
Dr. Zedillo, I would like to ask you, I had two questions. One was already asked because I was worried about people moving from Mexico to the United States. And you answered that question, but I'm still worried about people in Mexico. I am a Mexican, I live in Mexico City. I'm a professor from the National University. And I think I agree with you when you say that NAFTA has been good for Mexico. It has been good for me, there's no doubt. But I'm not sure it has been enough good for the very poor people in the country. I think the exclusion line you mentioned is still very high. And I'm worried if we have enough time to lower that exclusion line. I would like to ask you, when is this exclusion line going to go down? Do you think it will? Or
Well,
will have problems,
Yes.
social problems?
I agree with you, and that's the big issue, and that should continue to be the fundamental concern of Mexicans, both the government and the civil society, how we keep moving that exclusion line. And I think the exclusion line has been moving very slowly, perhaps too slowly, perhaps still too painfully slowly, you see. But we don't have, as a country, nor any other country has, a magic formula. I'm first to recognize that exclusion line, but as I said in my presentation, well, things cannot be done overnight. As I said, as I recall, Rome was not built in a day. I think we do have time because as long as the country progresses every year, as long as the country continues to produce more jobs, and you're right, we still have millions of people in the rural areas that haven't seen the benefits of globalization. But the fact that those people have not yet seen the benefits of globalization do not mean that we have to turn our backs to globalization, because globalization is one of the big opportunities we have to improve the condition of those people. So what we have to do is to be very effective in combining the opening up of our economy, sound macroeconomic policies, with sensible, well-designed social policies, so that we give people the means to become part of the new global, of the new economy. But this, of course, cannot be done overnight. The state needs resources to do that, because the state, the Mexican state, needs to spend more on education, more on health, more in providing these rural areas with more infrastructure. And that, of course, takes time. But we have to be patient, and we have to work or continue working very hard. But I am sure that we have time, and we'll catch up.
Thank you.
We have one more here.
Dr. Zedillo, I want to ask you, during your presidential term, which was your opinion toward the guerrilla Zapatista, and now which is your opinion as a human activist?
Well, my opinion as president was said many times when I was president, so you can go back to my speeches at the time. I don't have to quote myself, and right now, as any Mexican citizen, welcome any effort to have that dispute settled. Whoever has responsibility in that and can do good for that, for the solution of that problem, should have the support of any Mexican citizen. And of course, I support any effort to have a good, peaceful, civilized solution to that conflict.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. God bless you. That was great.
Thank you.